Normally, I'm not a big reading person, but because of where we are tonight, I'm going to read very briefly from an essay. It's the second essay in the book, and it is about the dot-com bubble and San Francisco and Smash Mouth and Stanford and how the techno-capitalist cyber utopia that we thought the 21st century was going to be in 1999 actually turned into the techno-capitalist dystopia. So, yeah. Almost every summer, we took the same flight, United Airlines nonstop, Dulles to SFO. I chewed watermelon bubblicious to keep my ears from popping, but they always did as we descended over the bay. It was an unusually steep descent, and as the flight attendants put up the tray tables, babies began inevitably to cry. I wanted to cry too, but instead I chomped and chomped, watching the water glitter into view. Soon, I told myself, we would be in the place that I called paradise. I'm going to skip ahead. I talk about how we have family here. My uncle has lived here for decades, and my mom went to high school in Palo Alto, and so we kind of have some strong, to the extent we have roots anywhere, we have some strong roots here. And my uncle got very involved in the dot-com bubble in the late 1990s, and spending time out here and with him shaped what I thought the future was going to be. So I'll sort of skip. Even then, I understood that San Francisco was where it was all happening. It was California, yes, and therefore inherently special due to its comfortable climate and semi-tropical flora, plus the fact that you had to sit on a plane for nearly 6 hours to get there. But more important, it was the headquarters of the internet, and the internet was where Uncle Paul worked. And then I'm just going to read a little bit here. So this starts with a quote from The California Ideology, which I think some of you might know. It's an essay by two critics in 1995 about what would become the tech sector, well, big tech, really. In American folklore, the nation was built out of a wilderness by freebooting individuals. The trappers, cowboys, preachers, and settlers of the frontier, they write. For both the new left and the new right, the early years of the American Republic provide a potent model for their rival versions of individual freedom. Yet there is a profound contradiction at the center of this primordial American dream. Individuals in this period only prospered through the suffering of others. You know this old saw already, the racist, sexist, imperialist myth of the frontier. But it bears repeating, and not only because it is true, but because less widely understood is the way that, at the turn of the last millennium, technology and the stock market were the frontier. And the promise of the frontier, of any frontier, is a promise of a radical break with history, of life without limits. Where else could this have happened but California? It was on Telegraph Hill where I thought I could best see the future. It was, in the words of Y2K era industrial designer Kareem Rashid, a never-ending, undulating, boundless shape in perpetual motion. In the new millennium, we could all invest in the stock market. We could all invest in startups and take a buyout and retire at age 45 like Uncle Paul. We could all log into the internet with our Bondi Blue iMacs and check our portfolios, then hop in our new Beatles and cruise Highway 1, a Smash Mouth CD on the stereo.
Well, first I want to congratulate you. This is a really readable book. It's entertaining, very sharp, and I loved reading it. This chapter in particular stands out because you bring to life San Francisco as the big city, because it seems like it was the big city to you. And your story of your uncle being someone who is an example of the Silicon Valley dream come true. And I wondered, maybe because so much of this book is your memories, as well as synthesizing that with political analysis and history. How did you understand your uncle's success when you were a child, and now how do you look at it?
Yeah, so when I was a child, so first, I think I should just clarify that the book is, it's everyone in it, to the extent that there are people in it, they're kind of like a stock character in a sense. Like even me, I'm a stock character for a suburban, upper middle class, like white millennial. I'm not even myself, if that makes sense. Like I'm a trope. Everyone's a trope. And so, yeah, when I was a kid, when this happened, his company was bought out in 1999. He got a big payout. And the way I understood this as a kid was that this would happen to everyone in the 21st century. So the new millennium's around the corner. We are all going to be rich. And, while I was writing this book, I thought, well, gee, I was 11 or I was 10, I was 11. Of course I thought this. Of course I was naive. I was a child. But I actually did research into media and kind of books at the time. And there were a great deal of books that were saying this stuff and media that was saying this stuff. Like there was in 1998, an economist at MIT named Rudy Dornbush said, "We will never have another recession again. We don't want one. We don't need one." And I think he said, "We have the technology to make sure we don't have one." And then there was a book called Dow 36,000, which I know doesn't sound like a big number because it hit 40 last year, but at the time it had just hit 10,000. So the idea was basically that it would that the Dow would go up in value like essentially 3 times where it was at within a couple of years. And by the way, the guy who wrote that, he did walk it back, obviously, after that was proven untrue, but he is I believe he has an important role in the Trump administration, someone told me so. But yeah, I was surrounded by these messages from the media, from adults in my life who were saying, the 21st century, we figured out the economy and we figured out how to make it so that we'll all have endless prosperity and peace. And obviously that didn't happen. I see it, to get to the second part of your question, I see, not again, his success as a stand-in, my uncle's success as a stand-in for a thing that happened to a lot of people at the time. Certainly, I'm sure some people in this room, perhaps. But yeah, I see it as a historically specific thing that happened. And it certainly wasn't, quote unquote, everybody. And, a lot of that wealth got wiped out by 2002. So a lot of it was paper money, essentially. And yeah, I don't know. I see it in a bigger historical context, and it seems kind of quaint and ridiculous now, and I sort of laugh at some of the things that pundits were saying, but yeah, I don't know. I kind of wish that it really were true that the 21st century would make everybody rich.
So in your book, you define the era as 1997-ish to the Great Recession of 2008. And I think one thing, we're looking back on it this week with a second Trump administration and a number of very thin advances that we've seen, trans rights, very, very thin advances for climate, environmental protections. All of that's wiped out this week. And the thing that I worry about, which you get into in your book, is the sense of burnout, that there's only so much that we can do. And to connect that, the line you wrote, politics are out again, just like they were when I was coming of age. And it's not that this era was apolitical by any means. It was more that there was this pop culture that you could retreat into. And I wondered if you could talk about this a little bit. Is it cyclical? What is different now for that desire, that nostalgia for Y2K? What are people finding in it?
Sorry, what are people finding in Y2K or in pop culture generally?
What's behind that?
Yeah, I mean, this was this time where everything felt really stable and peaceful, and it seemed like the 21st century, like I said, was going to be this wonderful techno utopia where we could all just log on the internet, get rich in the stock market, meet people. The internet would be a place where, instead of being a place that would like breed conspiracy theories and fascism, the internet or like put musicians and taxi drivers out of work. The internet would be a place where it would be like a marketplace, like an agora, where we would peacefully trade and we would share creative ideas. We would meet people from other cultures, and it would, and thus, bring about more peace and understanding in the world. And I think that that's really beautiful. And it's easy to kind of look at that now and kind of make fun of it, but I actually think that that was a cool idea. And I think people yearn for, particularly people my age who lived through this, and kind of like we came into political consciousness with the internet, with the arrival of the internet, with the sort of quote unquote end of history, which is what I talked about, this idea that everything is going to be peaceful and prosperous. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this yearning by people my age to go back to that. But then there's also, among younger people, there's kind of a curiosity. Like people, I was at Yale about a week ago, and I met people who were born in like 2004, and they don't have memories of 9/11, or like they've always had a smartphone, basically, because smartphones were introduced let's not hair split, but the iPhone was introduced in 2007. And so they haven't known a world without social media, without doom scrolling, without constant connection. And also, they came into consciousness in this chaotic post-2008 Donald Trump first term world. And so I think they look back and they sort of look at it and they're like, wow, that era, the late 90s, the early 2000s, the Y2K era, that was so peaceful, that was so fun. We weren't all strapped to our phones all the time, and I think there's a yearning for that.
And maybe if you could describe some of what that culture actually is. What are you nostalgic for of Y2K, and what are maybe some of the major things that you may or may not be nostalgic for?
Yeah, I guess I should start with the aesthetics. I'm obviously wearing a sort of Frutiger Arrow. It's not quite Frutiger Arrow. Don't get on me about that. But, okay, like 3 people get the joke. Amazing. But yeah, like I love the aesthetics of like 1997 through about 2003, where you had the Y2K aesthetic, which was like silver eyeshadow, silver nail polish, silver clothing, white everything. Like a good example of it would be if you've seen TLC's video for No Scrubs. They're wearing these amazing, sexy, silver, spacey outfits. They're on a space station dancing around. Their hair and makeup is really, it looks like it comes from the future. And yeah, that video came out in 1999. And when I see that video, I'm like, return. I want to return. Or like, in 1999, I talk about this in the opening chapter of my book. I begged my mom to buy me a silver inflatable chair from Target. And some of you, I think, probably had similar pieces of furniture. And I just love this chair because I was like, in the 21st century, we're all going to be like riding around we're all going to be logging onto the internet on our iMac G3s in like Bondi blue, or then the next year the colors were like lime, blueberry, tangerine. They're named after fruits as if it was like a candy. We're going to be logging on, we're going to be listening to these shiny silver futuristic CDs on our futuristic Discman. It's that whole futuristic aesthetic. What else was big? Yeah, so I talked about the iMac G3, so that spread over into other electronics. You had floppy disks, because people are still using floppy disks a little at this time, that were like bright, translucent blue and pink and purple. You had Game Boys that were translucent. You had you had like phones, you had TVs, all of these electronics kind of hopped on that bandwagon after the G3 came out. And to me, I sort of dive deep into it in the book, and I'm like, what this design says to me is that technology is fun, it doesn't have sharp edges, and you can see into it, it can't see you. And that really sums up how I think, you know, the general idea was that the internet and technology would work at the time, that it would promote transparency, it was fun, it was about connectivity, not, you know, it's like gonna spy on you and sell your data. I mean, another thing would be like another example of the Y2K aesthetic was the Volkswagen New Beetle. It's like round, it's fun, it's small, and then compare that to something like the Cybertruck, which is like, has tiny windows, it's sharp, it's like there's like a hardness and a military look to it, and it just feels like they both, to me, feel like they're from the future, but it's like a different future.
Okay, I have two questions that are kind of connected, and I feel like I might as well ask them together. So the first is, you do bring out that silver inflatable chair, it breaks down pretty much immediately, and I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on like the durability of all this plastic, and also I wondered if you could talk about what sets this Y2K futuristic aesthetic apart from, say, the Jetsons before, or the World's Fair, or previous generations of like fanciful visions of the future?
Yeah, I mean, so are you asking about the literal plastic, or are you asking about the way that I use it as a metaphor?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, obviously the literal plastic. And to be clear, we knew that plastic was bad at the time, because I talk in another essay about environmentalism and how, like, James Hansen testified in Congress in 1988, which is when I was born, about climate change being a major existential problem. And so throughout the 90s and the 2000s, climate change was a known factor in the future, and it kind of cast a dark shadow over, climate change, as well as just environmental degradation generally, kind of cast a dark shadow over all of these exciting, optimistic predictions, because it was like, well, we solved the Cold War, the stock market is going up, things seem relatively peaceful and prosperous, but we have this whole issue with rising carbon emissions. But in terms of using the chair as a metaphor, I talk about how it deflated very quickly, not unlike the dot-com bubble. And part of why I use that is because ultimately the dot-com bubble was built on hype, and it wasn't actually going to be durable. And so I think the yearning that I have to return to that era, at least to the sort of economic foundations of it's an impossible to fulfill yearning, because you're wanting something that's unstable. Like, it's like saying that I wish I had my inflatable chair again, which I do, but the problem with the inflatable chair was that it was built badly. It was always going to pop because of how it was built. And the problem, excuse me, I'm getting over a little cold, but the problem with the kind of political economy of the Y2K era was that it was fundamentally unstable, which, you know, we got a little preview of with the dot-com bubble, but then we really saw with 2008.
I was just wondering if the second part of the question, the ideas of this future of Y2K, how that might be different from previous eras.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. So basically, I think, like, if you look at, so I use this website called CARI, the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute. It's these volunteer archivists who kind of collect and analyze different consumer products and advertisements and media, and they categorize different aesthetics. So you have, like they talk about the Y2K aesthetic. They talk about another one, they talk about Frutiger Arrow, which is, I touched on, which is sort of like, think the Microsoft, the green hill, which I think is in Marin, the green Microsoft, like, screen, the grassy hill and like the sunny sunspots, blue sky. It's very like blue, green, like lime green, pink, yellow, sort of a dialed up, natural kind of nature look. They talk about the McBling aesthetic, which was later, it was like the juicy tracksuits and the really ostentatious Louis Vuitton bags and Hummers and things like that. They talk about what's called, what do they call it? They call it Groovival, which I also like. That was like late 90s, early 2000s. Like earlier Y2K, and what that was it was a nod at the 60s, which actually makes sense considering that a lot of it was sort of associated with the dot-com bubble and who were the people who were most involved in the dot-com bubble, people who came out of the counterculture, as did my uncle, by the way, which I talk about in the book. But yeah, like I think that the futurism differs because it's like, look, I mean, all futurism seems to sort of have a similarity, like it's sleek. It tends to have a lot of like silver and white, like Art Deco. Like I was just at the Coit Tower today, and that's done in Art Deco style, and that is, that was futuristic at the time, in the 30s and the 40s. The Y2K aesthetic pulled a lot from like 70s futurism. So like a lot of white, a lot of orange or green accents, like neon accents, a lot of clear plastic stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's different from like the Jetsons, which was more what's called Googie, so Googie was inspired by the atomic age and the space race. And, if you want to get, as I do, sort of like psychoanalytic here in terms of like reading, like what I do a lot in the book is I read the culture for what was happening at a sort of political historical level. The thing about the Googie look and the futurism of the Jetsons is that was all happening during the Cold War, the height of the Cold War, really. And what the thing about the Y2K era is that was happening during a time of relative peace after the end of the Cold War. And so I feel like you still see like, you almost see like rocketry images in Googie, and you see, I mean, it's almost like perfectly clear, fluid, blobby lines in the Y2K aesthetic. Like the Kareem Rashid quote I read, like he talks about how it's like this fluid, formless thing that's like ever expanding gently into the future.
So the book begins with a letter you wrote for Time Capsule as a kid, and you discuss finding it in 2018. And I wondered, is that beginning of the idea for this book, or if you could talk about that letter, what dreams you had of the future at that age, and how you're looking back on them now?
Yeah, well, let's see. So, yeah, so I found this letter. At the time, things in my life were going pretty badly, for a lot of reasons. And I was just feeling despairing. And I was also on top of my own kind of personal problems. I was very anxious and upset about the election of Trump and about, like the fires, that were happening here in Northern California, and were getting worse and worse and worse. And I was very, very anxious about climate change, and I was like really feeling a lot of angst. And I can't remember which happened first, because around this time I really found solace in these Instagram accounts that would have these scans of like teen people from 1998 and YM from 2001. And I would love looking at the fashions, at the celebrities that I enjoyed when I was in, late elementary and middle and early high school. I started listening to all the same music, like pop music and then bad new metal and like good hip hop that I listened to at that era. And I found myself kind of retreating into nostalgia and thinking like, gosh, it was so great back when all I had to worry about was like my stupid inflatable chair deflating. But around this time in 2018, I found this letter in a box at my parents' house. And so in 1999, my elementary school, I was in 5th grade, my elementary school in Northern Virginia made a time capsule, which this was a very common thing at the time, that schools or communities would make these Millennium time capsules to be opened in the future. And what I guess had happened was each student in the class had assigned to pick a different year. I had been assigned 2008. So I said, in 2008, I will be a junior at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. Let's see, we will be watching our movies over the internet. Musicians will be using the computer to make music. And we will be starting to do something about the environment, like banning power boats and stuff. So 2 of those things happened. I'll let you guess which, or you can read the book. Reading this, it was very jarring because I had such optimism at the time. So I was 30 when I found this, and I was like 10, almost 11 when I wrote it. And I was like, who is this person? Because I basically in 2018 was like, there's no future. Everything is fucked. My life is, I don't know what, the future of my life is going to be terrible, and the future for everyone else is going to be terrible. Like I said, I was in a really bad place. But reading that, it was like reading a letter from a complete stranger. And I think that it was such a marked contrast, both what I saw for the possibilities in my own future, and what I saw for the possibilities in terms of like, hey, we will do something about climate change. Hey, we're going to keep, another thing I said, and this actually was true, I predicted all of these advances in terms of like cancer and AIDS treatment, and that actually did happen. But, I had this really optimistic outlook, and then I looked at how I felt, and I was like, this is so different. What the hell happened? And that really got me on this path to write the book. So I got the contract for the book in 2022. I signed with HarperCollins. But I was sort of marinating on the ideas from like around 2018, 2019, 2020, for like almost half a decade.
If you don't mind me asking about that process, like when you read that letter, was that when you started watching the Y2K movies or listening to the music, or was it more like later on?
I can't remember which happened first. I think I was already into the nostalgia stuff when I found the letter, and the letter was, just extra jarring. But yeah, I actually can't remember what the order was, but I think I was into the nostalgia stuff first.
Were there films in particular that really, when you revisited them, you could sense the change? Or
yeah, so the best one is You've Got Mail, and yes, actually Megan Day has a really good piece about it, which I don't know, she published it in like 2019. I had like this long like diary entry about watching You've Got Mail, and like 20 years later, and how jarring it was. So I feel like we independently came to the same conclusions. So I didn't end up talking about it. I talk about it a little in the essay about Starbucks and unions, but I was originally going to have a separate essay, but I didn't want to duplicate what she already did. But yeah, I mean, the thing about You've Got Mail is everyone is financially comfortable. When Meg Ryan loses her job, it's like, fine, whatevs. And then she basically marries like proto Jeff Bezos, so it's fine, whatever. And like the other thing is that you know, like part of it is that the way everyone talks about the internet too is like you're gonna meet your spouse on there. You're not gonna go on there and like join QAnon or become anti-vaxxer, right? Like I feel like I joke, but if You've Got Mail took place now, I mean, Meg Ryan would go into, she'd go onto like Twitter or something and then just gradually get radicalized into a right-wing conspiracy theorist, and then like she would finally have her meet cute. Instead of in that little garden on the Upper West Side, she and Tom Hanks would meet at January 6th.
Yeah, I love that movie too. It's to watch it now and see that this idea was you're bringing your, maybe not your best self, but your secret self and connecting in the ether that way. Another really strong theme in this book is like the activism that was thwarted. And you were writing a little bit, we had, if we were to go a little earlier before the period you're documenting, that would have been a moment of political consciousness raising on college campuses that would be dismissed as political correctness. But even in that era, there were the WTO protests, there was activism highlighting the abuses of sweatshops and elsewhere. And I'm wondering, we kind of see where that went, but what are your thoughts about that activism and whether you can draw a line from that to Occupy perhaps or later movements?
Yeah, I mean, what I say in the book is that, so the way this kind of worked, and to be clear, I wasn't really, and I'm ambivalent about whatever, like the efficacy and goals of that particular movement, the anti-WTO stuff, but yeah, I mean, what I talk about in the book is that there's this idea that I've been talking about all night that it's the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st. We fixed it. We fixed the economy. We basically effectively have world peace and universal prosperity, and everything's just going to keep getting better and better. And then this, that was the quote unquote, Francis Fukuyama end of history idea, that we solved it. And we solved history, and it's done now. But yeah, so the WTO protests in Seattle were like this big middle finger to the rest of, to this end of history consensus. And it was this idea that, well, hey, actually this post 1991 global order actually has, on purpose or by accident created all these sweatshops and these environmental problems, and has led to an undermining of democracy. And so it was kind of shocking to people. Like I write about how I was shocked because I thought everything was good and everyone was rich now, or was going to be rich. And so I think it was just received in a kind of a confused way. But what I say happened is that then 9/11 happened, and just that was toast. That was over. Like what basically happened was that any kind of political action was like, it was already sort of marginal because people didn't have a reason to be political. Like I certainly didn't. Everything was going great for me. Why would I think about politics or activism when things were going so great? And it wasn't until, so 9/11 happened, and then you had this real reactionary turn, and there was this idea that like, even if you criticize George W. Bush as the singer of the Dixie Chicks, now the Chicks did, you would be like cast out of public life and get death threats. And so why the hell would you participate in like, an economic type protest? But it wasn't until 2008 where I say politics came back, because it pulled the rug out from everyone, and it challenged, people like me. Like I struggled to find a job after college, and it was that experience that made me think, there might be something wrong politically. And I think that was a fairly common generational experience, because most people are not going to just go out of their way to be activists unless there's something that kind of pushes them or makes them they have an experience that leads them toward that, usually. And so I think the thing with Occupy is that there were certainly people, there was a continuity, I think, especially with like older, like the quote unquote Gen X cohort. Like, I know people who were part of both, and were also part of like anti-war organizing throughout the George W. Bush administration. But, for millennials, it was mostly, for the most part, it was like discovering this stuff afresh. And it was also a little bit different. It was a little bit more like, think about Bernie Sanders versus anarchists, basically.
I have one more question before we move on to audience questions, and that was if you have any outtakes you might share or things that you felt you didn't quite fit this book, and if you want to share maybe why you didn't, or if you do have anything like that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I had a whole essay about how in the 1997 FDA Modernization Act allowed for really hilarious direct-to-consumer TV ads for pharmaceuticals that included Bob Dole, the former 1996 presidential candidate, talking about his boners. But that just ended up not being a whole essay, and so I just cut that one anecdote and put it into another essay, which is about sex and porn. And then another one that I wanted to write, but just sort of ran out of time with the timeline, was an essay about I believe it was like the 2006 New York real estate rezoning of Williamsburg and how that killed indie sleaze.
All right, do we have any questions from the audience?
Should I stand up? Or sure. Okay.
All eyes are on you. Everyone look at him.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for this. I've been waiting. I was talking to this person sitting next to about how we were both waiting for someone to write a book like this that wasn't like pablum, basically. So, thank you.
You're welcome.
I was born in 2002, but my parents were weird Gen Xers who were broke, so my cultural, I grew up 4 years before, I was always kind of behind, and now that I'm a young adult, and like you mentioned with Yale, with the sort of Y2K nostalgia of teenagers and sort of young people, the thing that has really stuck out to me is sort of the post-irony aspect of, and I guess on the other flip side, the thing that is incredibly strange about it to me is the reclamation of sort of the most embarrassing aspects of 2000s culture. That Limp Bizkit is headlining festivals. I remember distinctly, it was I guess 7 months ago or so, when there was the campus occupation at SF State, and a girl walked up to me to ask, I was there, and there was a meeting or something, and a girl walked up in the most garish, Family Guy shirt I'd ever seen in my entire life, and this was a freshman, an 18-year-old or something, and I don't know, that just this sort of, yeah, you thought this thing was really obnoxious and lame, and in the case of both of those examples, very kind of not aged well,
Yeah.
problematic in a number of ways, but then being reclaimed by largely kind of girls or LGBT people, and I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was, you wrote a book on it, so.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, and thank you for coming out. But yeah, so I don't think I got a chance to talk about the stuff I didn't like about Y2K. Basically, sexism, racism, and Hummers. But yeah, it was a really misogynistic time, and it was complete, also homophobia, I forgot to say that, how could you forget? You had just using the F slur was normal, and it was actually MTV had in 2003 they had a little sketch on the movie awards where I think I want to say Dobby or Gollum, one of them calls the other one the F slur. That dude, where's my car? A major plot point is that trans women are gross. Girls Gone Wild basically was revealed to be like just a series of allegedly sexual assaults, largely. There were just making rape jokes was considered completely normal and expected. I mean, it was a really disgusting time and a really difficult time to be not like a cis white man. And a lot of the sort of what gets called like the social justice culture was a backlash to that, because people were like, this sucks and I hate it. And and so I think that now there's sort of this backlash it's kind of this, like a backlash to the backlash, where it's like, now people are like saying slurs again, I guess. And it's stupid, because it's like, okay, you sound like the most annoying person at my middle school. I don't love that. The interesting thing about Limp Bizkit is, like, even though their lyrics are very misogynist, and Fred Durst said some questionable things to the press at the time, I feel like they're not Trumpists. Like, Kid Rock is performing at, hanging around with Trump. I feel like I've seen them say, like, fairly politically good, or at least unproblematic stuff, or like Durst has. Also, like, the Family Guy guy, Seth MacFarlane, he again, I don't know, like, I'm not like, he's my political idol or whatever, but, you don't have to be. But, like, the show isn't, and I don't know, it's not like Trump. He doesn't like Trump, right? He's not, I don't know, I just don't see it as, like, I see what you're saying, but I feel like, I don't know, I'm rambling, sorry, I haven't had dinner.
Fred Durst was in I Saw the
He was in
TV Glow.
He was in I Saw the TV Glow. How can you say anything? I feel like that's, part of, that's cool. That's cool. Thank you.
Anyone else?
In the front room.
Yes, I have a comment and a question. In 2000, the compute power of general things was so low compared to nowadays, where it's just kind of supporting what we could do manually, and that the idea that they could replace, labor or whatever, was far-fetched. And it was only 6 years at that point that the internet had become public. So I'm kind of curious, the idea, the ramifications of technology was still nascent. And in your research, have you found anything kind of touching on the rise of tech libertarianism, which is what kind of the Peter Thiels and
yes.
How that kind of rises?
I mean, it was always there, because the dot-com bubble starts in 1995 with the Netscape IPO. Well, who was one of the big guys at Netscape? Andreessen, who we all know from Twitter and from, his support of Trump. I mean, this has always been there. It's not like this thing that was just introduced recently. I mean, I'm sure you guys, most of you have heard of or read Malcolm Harris's Palo Alto, where he traces the history of tech to essentially the 1850s in the Bay Area. And he talks about how, founding members of Stanford were eugenicists. They recruited people specifically based on eugenic principles. They were tied up in the war machine throughout the 20th century and still are. Palmer Luckey isn't like a newfangled guy. He's just kind of keeping the tradition alive with worse shirts and facial hair. But I mean, this has always been there. Oh, and to say nothing of the Hoover Institution.
And also that essay you cite, the California Ideology.
The California Ideology in 1995, they saw it. These two critics in 1995, I forget their names, but they saw the sort of, I don't even want to call it, I guess, nascent fascism, but I guess the fascism that's always been there too.
Yeah, it's Cameron and Barbaric, and I mean, what they do is they explain like how the glitz of this yuppie hippie synthesis that was the Bay Area aesthetic that was dreaming to the rest of the world, how that covers over and erases the actual abuses that's on the ground in San Francisco at the same time.
And the other one that I would recommend for people, for you or for others curious about this, is there's a Stanford professor named Fred Turner, and he has a book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture, and he talks about this. And actually, one of the things that he finds is that even within the counterculture, which we think of as like hippie and nice, there's a lot of sexism and racism, and like they saw themselves as like cowboys dominating the landscape. And yeah, and just like there's a lot of weird, and it was also very libertarian. It was about like quote unquote self-sufficiency. And yeah, there's always been a lot of weird stuff going on. Yes.
I'm curious what you think of the assertion that like this moment that your book is about it was sort of the last point where there was like an identifiable monolithic mainstream that everyone was tuned into.
Thank you, internet, for ending that.
Right, that the internet completely fractured. That was the last moment before the internet fractured it mostly beyond recognition. I don't know, yeah, just what sort of thoughts you had on that? Or...
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. Like, you know, I saw, you know, my husband who's here, he and I watched this show, Say Nothing, a couple weeks ago, and I've been talking about it to people, and they're like, "What's that? I've never heard of it." And whereas in the Y2K era, everyone knew about Sex and the City, even if they didn't watch it, and everyone watched it together. And yeah, bye monoculture. I kind of miss it.
And the streaming services are still centralized.
Yeah.
But still, so much stuff falls through the cracks.
Sure.
There's their own little niche.
Yeah, everything's all diffused, and it's also algorithmic, so everyone's kind of siloed into the For You pageification of everything, where like I get stuff that's recommended. Like my Instagram is just animals and vintage fashion, and so to me, the entire world is animals and vintage fashion. Yeah.
So I'm also going to do like a comment question, but I'm hoping we've kind of had these conversations before, you know, just ourselves, and maybe we can kind of open it up. But you made the kind of comparison between the Beetle and today the Cybertruck. But I think in some ways the Hummer and now the Cybertruck is in some ways even more interesting because in a sense that's progress, right? It's now an electric vehicle.
Yeah.
But the fundamental political, cultural barbarism.
It's the same thing.
Barbarism is entirely, it's remained, and in some ways,
the same message. It
transmits
the same message.
Right. It's even been doubled down in some ways. And I wonder if like what marked that period wasn't so much like an all-encompassing optimism. Although there was a lot of that in certainly like the dominant liberal, centrist, mainstream, I think that was the case. But it was actually just this conviction across the board, with the exception of the WTO protests, which I think that's what makes it really unique, is that we don't need politics. We don't need a fundamental transformation in any sense of like the fundamentals of our society. And that, you know, we were just disagreeing about what techno fix would be required. I'm just curious if you, and I'll just like more about the WTO, because I think it's like, that was such an, like, in retrospect, I feel like that was so important. And the fact that it was so quickly forgotten.
Well, it was 9/11, because I mean, what basically happened, so about the WTO, so first of all, people were either like, I'm not going to get involved in this post 9/11 global war on terror era when everyone's, you know, wearing American flag t-shirts, or if they were political, they quite understandably poured their resources and attention into trying to stop the war in Iraq, or, you know, protesting or trying to address policies of like spying and kind of rights infringement at home. And so it just put anyone who sort of wanted to change things, it put them into this defensive posture where like they couldn't even, there was no, everything was so screwed up by that point that it was like, well, first we have to like put out this giant fire before we can go out and deal with this other problem. So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sure.
We've got time for one more question.
One more question. Should we do something?
Woman.
Who should we do?
I see the woman in the second
woman.
row.
Yes, finally, a woman.
Yeah. So finally a woman. So the flip side of the monolithic mainstream culture is that around Y2K, when I was 25, there was a really vibrant alternative culture.
Yeah.
And I feel sad for kids today who don't have that kind of safe haven, political, smart, arty weirdos. We had a place to go to find each other that was not as hegemonic as the mainstream culture, but certainly a little bit more defined than I think the fractured landscape is today. And so you've done a lot of excavating of mainstream culture. I haven't read the book, but I've listened to you. So have you excavated the alternative culture that was also really active and vibrant at the time? And do you see strands of that, or what happened to that?
No, that's a really good question. So most of the guiding principle of this was sort of trying to tell my own life story and a bigger life story. So there's a lot of stuff that just didn't make it in. Like the Indie Sleaze essay was kind of going to touch on a lot of this stuff, but it just didn't make it in. But yeah, like, I've looked into like, obviously like in the 90s and before, in the 80s you had like college radio, and that was a big connector for people who were into like what was called alternative music, but then that became like a branding thing, and it was somehow like Bush for some reason, even though originally it was like REM and stuff like that. But yeah, and then you had like obviously Riot Girl in the early 90s, and then you had just a lot of like weird, interesting local scenes that sort of like went national. Like the fact that the Butthole Surfers had a national hit is insane. It only could have happened in the 90s. And I've also, I might write about this, I might not in the future in an essay or something, but the political economy of the music industry is very interesting in the 90s. So first of all, the arrival of CDs, the changing over from tapes to CDs, provided a huge influx of capital into the music industry. And so there was a lot of liquidity because people were buying, trading in their CDs or their tapes for CDs rather. The other thing was that because Napster hadn't happened yet, streaming hadn't happened yet, you still needed physical media if you wanted to listen to music. There was also a lot of liquidity because throughout the economy in the latter half of the 90s because of the dot-com bubble and the booming stock market. And so not just the music industry, but a lot of other industries, there's just like a lot of cool and weird little consumer stuff that was able to get financed and made that it was harder to do later. Then the other thing was that, so in 1991, Nirvana happened, or they broke through rather, as this, the biggest band of that generation, and that kind of shocked and surprised the music industry, and they were like, hey, we didn't see that coming. Hell, we'll let Fiona Apple cut a big album and put a lot of money into promoting it and put her on tour and get her on MTV. We'll let all kinds of just we'll let a million weird flowers bloom, and then that the end of all of those things, the start of streaming music, downloading and then streaming, and then the sort of economic contractions, all of that kind of made basically by like the sort of very early 2000s was the last time when the music industry was really like taking chances and splashing out, and not even just splashing out, but just like giving people a bunch of money for stuff basically. But yeah, I guess I don't know. I think there is a lot to be said about alternative culture, but I also feel like, one, people like Michael Azerrad did a better job. I feel like I didn't want to write something that had already been written, and I've already read Our Band Could Be Your Life, and so I didn't want to like remake it. Because I didn't think there's anything I could say that he hasn't said or that others haven't said. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, a little bit. I'm just curious how it resonates. I'm hopeful that it resonates through today. It maybe not in the same way, right? But that there's something beyond the fractured, whatever we have.
I hope so. I mean, the one sort of nice thing is that people are, I guess, with things being fractured and everything being accessible, I think that people are able to access stuff that was harder to access. But like, I don't know, I miss, like, I wish that there was still, like, obviously there are still record stores, but the sort of record store culture where you would go in and you would like befriend the person there who would like introduce you to all kinds of cool stuff you otherwise wouldn't have heard of, or you had like your cool friend or your cousin or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I miss it. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, Colette. Thank you for a terrific book, and thank you everyone for coming. Car, Green Apple Books. This has been terrific, and it's really such an achievement. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Can we keep it going for Colette Shade?
You're welcome.
And I appreciate you all being here. Thank you so kindly. I will be brief and just let you know that we have copies. We have a couple copies of Joanne's book, one of Joanne's books, and Colette's book is at the front register. You can find them there. Colette is going to be signing at the back desk right here. We also have other books. If you want to take a look at those as well, you're welcome to. We're open till 9. Please make yourselves comfortable. If you have any questions, let me know. And if not, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.